Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Pepe Jijon wash processed Ecuador from Say Coffee. And there's the box right there. And Say, based out of Brooklyn, New York. And this might be one of the most anticipated reviews we've ever had on this channel, as Pepe Jijon is one of my favorite producers in the entire world. In fact, his coffees finished first and second place in our top 10 coffees of 2022 list. So once this coffee was released, we did receive a lot of messages from people asking whether or not we were going to be reviewing this coffee. And let me go ahead and take you back to the release of this one, as it was actually released alongside two other Ecuadorian coffees, a natural processed Geisha from Juan Peña, as well as a different Pepe Jijon, this one being a Sidra coffee. And I did contemplate purchasing all three, as I was interested in all three of those coffees. However, I have said in the past that we've been reviewing too many of Say's coffees, so I decided just to go with this one, and like a lot of other people, my order was canceled as they actually oversold this coffee. And this is where I have to give a major shout out to and thank you to my good buddy Zach, who actually went to the effort of driving up to their coffee shop in Brooklyn and found this inside their store. So he was nice enough to purchase this coffee and send it to me, and for that reason, this review is actually dedicated to Zach, so I really appreciate it, Zach. Without you, this review wouldn't have happened. So that's enough of an introduction. Let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee, as this right here is day 38. And recipe we went with for this coffee was my standard recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one, it's very much in line with my previous experiences with modern Say's coffees, as they're not necessarily as light as they had been in years past, but this one still is pretty light by most standards and metrics, as it just falls in line with the expectation that you might have from a lot of their more modern coffees, which is, well, basically just a very light coffee in general. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 17, first impression, and the cup was immediately reminiscent of previous experiences I'd had from Pepe Jijon's Mejorado coffees, as it offered so many sweet aspects with this floral herbality cooling down into this amazing brown candy-like sweetness. Right from the start, so many sugary sweet aspects, and it just made me feel nostalgic for the previous Pepe Jijon coffee I'd had from Manhattan, which was my favorite coffee of the entirety of 2022. So right off the bat, it did reach some very sky-high expectations I'd had from this coffee. Amazing first impression. Day 19, ran it through the Chemex, and interestingly enough, it was even more impressive this time around. And it is worth noting that the Pepe Jijon from Manhattan I did enjoy the most through the Chemex as well, as this one offered a lot more of those brown candied sweet aspects to the cup, with a super sweet cup start to finish. Candied berry aspects were very strong in this one as well, and that's something that I will focus on a lot throughout this video. In addition to that, there was a strong brightness and acidity, leading to another wonderful cup. Day 22, ran it through the April dripper, and there were a lot of positives, as it did continue to remain on the sweeter side of things. However, I didn't enjoy this one as much as I'd enjoyed the first 2 days, as it did focus a little bit more on the herbal and floral aspects, as opposed to the very candied berry-like attributes to this one. This one in general felt a lot more Kenyan-like, and if you do read the descriptor of this coffee, then you would go into it expecting it to be a very Kenyan-like cup of coffee. In fact, I had some people say to me that this coffee in theory on paper doesn't necessarily sound like my type of coffee, but I kind of explained to them it's the producer and it's the variety about this coffee that I really love, and that's why I had such a high expectation for it. Even then, this one was very Kenyan-like, a little bit more of the savory aspects to it, so it was still a very nice day, just not necessarily my favorite of this coffee. Day 25, adjusted to Say's recipe and ran it through the V60, of course Say's recipe being pushing the extraction, so a much higher temperature with a finer grind. And this was actually my least favorite coffee up to this point, as it was a lot more Kenyan-like with a significantly less amount of sweeter aspects with this one. Very herbal, with a heightened focus on that red florality to it, and they do have a hibiscus note listed on here, and I appreciate that they have a hibiscus note listed on here, because this was a very red cup of coffee. Had a lot of floral aspects, had a lot of savory aspects, had a lot of herbal aspects, so that will always skew in the direction of that. So even if it wasn't on here, that's a note that I would point towards and say this was very defined within this coffee. Moderately bright as well, but given that it wasn't necessarily quite as candied sweet on this day, a little bit more of a focus on that herbality, then this one wasn't necessarily my least favorite today, in fact, up to this point. Day 27, adjusted to Say's recipe with the Chemex this time around, and this was better than the experience I'd had with the V60 at Say's recipe, but it still wasn't quite as good as the earlier days, as there was a fair bit of the earlier sweetness, but not to the same extent and vibrancy as I'd experienced on the earlier days. This one did focus a lot on that red raspberry candied aspect, and that's something that maybe I haven't mentioned as much to this point, but when I was grinding this coffee, that's what it smelled like the most to me, was this candied red raspberry, and it was something I really enjoyed when it was present within the cup itself. I've been mentioning that it really skews heavy in the red direction, but in a much more clean red direction, very reminiscent of a lot of Kenyan-like characteristics. So this one was a better day. However, day 30 right here, this is the best day I'd experienced this coffee. It's one of my favorite days of coffee that I've ever mentioned on this channel in the entirety of the time we've been reviewing coffees, as this right here was special. Back through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it had been every bit as good as those first couple of impressions, if not better. Incredibly candied sweet. And it was the sweetest cup of coffee I've ever had from Say in my entire life, as I was really impressed and blown away by the amount of sweetness I was picking up from it. Super candied red fruit with a beautiful red florality and a lot of that brown candied sweetness that I attribute to the Mejorado coffees, something I didn't think was possible from Loring roasted coffees. This one was a real standout today, really impressed with this day 30 mark. However, from this point going forward, was not able to replicate those heights, as I tried to determine whether or not it was the amount of time we'd let this coffee rest or it was the adjustments we'd made. As I tried the same thing, this time back through the Chemex, and it's at this moment I decided that my preference was the V60 for this coffee, as it was a very good day once again. But it was slightly more herbal focus as opposed to the candied red fruit, being a little bit more toned back in this brew method. Still sweet, but not quite as lively and vibrant, not picking up as much of those brown candied aspects to this one. So another nice day, but this one kind of settled it for me that I definitely preferred the V60. Day 36, final notes we have, and I actually believe, interestingly, this coffee might have been at its best at that day 30 mark, and I highlighted and focused on that day 30 because of just how good that coffee was. And interestingly, I've had discussions with Zach about this because he said that he enjoyed this coffee a little bit more on this day, that the coffee continues to improve for him. So that's where we're getting a little bit of difference, but this coffee was a little inconsistent, it was a little finicky, and it was a little difficult to brew, which has been my experiences with Pepe Jijon's Mejorado coffees in the past as well. So that doesn't surprise me that we were having two very different experiences, but this day 36 mark, it did not have the same sort of vibrancy, even with a replicated recipe as well. So it could be that this coffee was very sensitive to the brew. However, here on day 38, I'm kind of experiencing that same thing. As the more time that's passed with this, it becomes a little bit more reminiscent of those Kenyan coffees, and it's losing a lot of those Mejorado traits that really set this coffee apart, that of course being that candied red raspberry aspect, as well as that brown candied aspect as well, with a little bit more of a focus on that herbal aspect, so that hibiscus-like component that they have listed on here. It's still a very good coffee. Day 36, day 38, still very good coffees, but I feel like that day 30 mark was special, and it's something that I wish I could replicate on the days that passed afterwards. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those real quick, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Yes, and I think there's a lot to discuss in that cleanliness. I think a lot of people would have expected it to reach that level 4 mark going into it, and there's just so much to say about it, but we'll start with this. Even the Pepe Jijon from Manhattan that I had last year that finished as my #1 coffee of 2022, it reached that level 4. It did not reach that level 5 mark because it's not necessarily the most defined coffee to begin with. It's a little bit more, I do want to say subtle. It's very distinct, but at the same time, it just has a little bit of a subtlety to it as well, if that makes any sense. But in addition to that, if I was to say that this was a Kenyan coffee, because it had a lot of Kenyan-like characteristics, and the way they described this coffee, you would expect it to have a lot of Kenyan-like characteristics. It might be the cleanest Kenyan coffee I've ever had, and if it was a Kenyan coffee, then maybe I could have justified that level 5 mark. Even then, I think it just belongs right there in that level 4 mark, as I usually reserve that level 5 for, well, basically only Gesha coffees that have just a huge abundance of clarity. Even then, I definitely feel like it belongs in that level 4 mark. Finish, level 4. Yes, and I don't think that'll come as a surprise to anybody, and given that this one offered so many Kenyan-like characteristics to it, then it was always going to reach that level 4 mark. Fair bit of brightness, a lot of those candied aspects, the red raspberry and that brown candy. In addition to that, the florality, which are the three things I'm focusing on the most. They all had a very noticeable presence in the finish itself. Especially when I was able to get that brown candy, it made the finish a very wonderful part of this coffee. Sweetness, level 4. This is the other thing that's really worth discussing a lot in this tasting wheel, because this was the sweetest coffee I've ever had from Say, and I toyed around with the idea of putting it at that level 5, and I think maybe if I'd made this tasting wheel on day 30, I made it on day 33, then it would have justified that level 5 in terms of the sweetness. But since I didn't, I feel like it's on the higher side of level 4, and even if I was being super generous, it's still on the lower side of the level 5, but it is a very sweet coffee. As mentioned, the sweetest coffee I've ever had from Say, so don't let the tasting wheel take away from the fact that it is still a very sweet cup of coffee. Acidity, level 4. I did mention that it might not necessarily be as bright as some of the very light profiled Kenyan coffees that I've experienced in the past. Even then, it did have enough of the brightness to justify that level 5 mark, that level 4 mark, but I don't think that that's too surprising given that Say is still light in general, and this coffee does seem to offer a fair bit of brightness as well, given that it has a lot of Kenyan-like qualities to it. Florality, level 4. And this is one of 3 level 4s that are really worth discussing in terms of the flavor themselves. So this right here had a lot of those hibiscus-like characteristics to it. I fully expected that going into it, as that's something I've experienced from almost every single Mejorado coffee I've had, as they do have this interesting herbal component to it, and given that they are very red-forward cups of coffee, it makes for a very easy and distinct definition within this coffee. So florality, level 4, very much in line with that hibiscus characteristic. Berry fruit, level 4. Yes, that's the other thing. It had a lot of those kind of currant tart berry characteristics to it, and that's something that I have experienced in varying measure with a lot of the Mejorado coffees as well. So that was very pronounced and defined in this one, and given that oftentimes it was very candied, it was actually one of the better aspects of this coffee, and a coffee that had so many wonderful aspects. But the most important thing out of everything in this tasting wheel is that caramel at the level 4. And that represents 2 things. The candied-like component of this one, most distinctly those berries, because I always put candied-like attributes in that caramel level. And then the other thing being that brown candied sweetness that was present within this one. Again, it's the type of sweetness I don't necessarily expect to experience from luring roasted coffees. It's kind of this like Probat-like sweetness, and that's why I like the Probat as much as I do. It's because it has that sort of brown candy sweetness, and that's like a trademark of Manhattan's coffees, and why I've enjoyed their coffee so much in the past is because it has that special, unique characteristic to it. And the Mejorado kind of evens the playing field because it can have that aspect with other roasting machines as well. So that's a big deal. That being there at the level 4 is maybe the most important thing to take away from this tasting wheel, because I was experiencing so much of that brown candied aspect, and it's what separated this coffee from basically being a very good Kenyan-like coffee to a unique, more, I would say, complex Ecuadorian coffee in general. Then a couple of level 3s. The body, level 3, medium bodied. I think that was probably due to the fact that it was with the V60, as well as the fact that it's still a South American coffee, so I don't think that there's too much to say on that one, honestly. Citrus level 3, that's been in line with my experiences with Mejorado coffees, as well as they do have this kind of sweeter citric aspect to it. It's an interesting citric aspect. I don't think it was necessarily as pronounced or highlighted in this coffee as it had been from some of the other Mejorado coffees I've had in the past. Even then, it was distinct and noticeable enough to reach that level 3 mark. We have a couple of level 2s, but honestly, I don't think any of them are really worth discussing, because I feel like we've addressed the major parts of this tasting wheel. So for that reason, I think that this is a pretty accurate representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like I could probably talk about this coffee for a very long time, but I'm not entirely sure how I want to finish on this one. Here's, I think, one direction I'll go is this was one of the best coffees I've had this year when I got it at its best. And when it was at that optimal point, that day 30 mark for me, I would say that it's the best coffee I've had to this point this year. However, at the same time, it was a tricky coffee, and I feel like I wasn't able to always replicate the best of those results, and that's why, at the end of the day, it's one of those things where I'm just going to wonder how it will age towards the end of the year, how will I remember this coffee, and I do have a little bit of this left. I probably have 2 to 3 more cups of this coffee that I'm, of course, going to freeze, and I'm going to decide what I want to do with it in the future, but this one was just tricky. There's a lot of positives to this one, and I think it continues to show just how much I enjoy Pepe's coffees, because I went into this one with sky-high expectations, and there were a lot of times that reached those sky-high expectations, but it still had some of the tricky components that made his coffees in the past a little bit more tricky for me in general, so I'm in 2 minds on this one. At its best, it's incredible, but at the same time, it can be a little frustrating too, and it didn't necessarily seem to hold as long as I might have expected or wanted it to. And that could, of course, be because maybe it was just a little bit more finicky in general. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I feel like the easiest suggestion to point somebody towards is your Kenyan coffee drinkers, because this one had so many of those Kenyan-like attributes to it. But I feel like if you've enjoyed a lot of the Mejorado coffees in the past, and this one is a very good representation of that, because I think at the end of the day, I can say that of the same Mejorado coffees I've had to this point, this one was better than the Luzon, it was better than the Guillermo Lomas, and it's one of the best coffees I've ever had from Say altogether. And I still don't know what I'm going to make of it as this one ages in my mind, but I'm just kind of at a loss for how I want to describe this one, so I think I will leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you enjoyed the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Pepe Jijon Wash Process Ecuador from Say Coffee. Thank you for watching.